Here in Lesson 11, we'll be taking a look at Colossians 3:18 through chapter 4, verse 1. And this section of text really discusses submission to the authorities that God has established. And it does a tremendous job of showing just what made a Christian, a follower of Jesus of Nazareth, distinct in the first century. And it is tied very closely to the teachings that Paul has given in the previous section that we looked at, which is the first 10 chapters of Colossians 3. Remember that Paul argues for the believer to obey the Lord willingly because they have been made righteous through Christ's sacrifice and resurrection and their subsequent faith in that. In this section, then, Paul explains that this humble posture of obedience is meant to translate to a believer's relationship with their family members and other members of the church. Sometimes this is, you'll hear this talked about as the degree to which one's horizontal relationships with people here on earth translates to their vertical relationship with God. That's one way of talking about it. Paul puts a little more flesh on the bone, so to speak. And what's interesting about this section is that Paul's teachings go both ways. In other words, those under God-ordained authority should submit themselves as if the Lord is acting through that authority. And conversely, those in positions of authority should act as the Lord acts toward those under his authority. So it's a principle that he applies not just to those under authority, but to those in authority as well. And he covers all of his bases that way. He talks about children and their parents, children being under the authority of the parents, and the parents' responsibility to their children as figures in authority. He talks about slaves and their masters, which we'll talk about in just a second. And his application, again, it goes to both those under authority and both those in authority. And he essentially says, treat each other as Christ has treated them, irregardless of the position you find yourself in. It's an interesting idea. To the question of slavery, which often comes up in modern conversations in this passage, it's just part of the warp and woof of the ancient world, and you have to understand that. Slavery in the first century Mediterranean world looked very different from slavery which we think of today, which is what white Europeans did in the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries in the West, which was the forcible removal of people from their homes, putting them in grueling environments, work environments. And slavery in the ancient Mediterranean world was not quite that. You really didn't see that kind of thing outside of instances of warfare. It was there, but it was nowhere near as prominent as it was in the later centuries in the West. Really what you saw in the ancient Mediterranean world was something closer to what might be called indentured servitude, where people would willingly enter themselves into slavery or servitude to pay off debts or loans. And again, it was just part of the warp and woof of the first century world. There was no getting around it. What is very interesting, however, is Paul's application here of this principle in that particular context. Very, very distinct. He challenges not only the slaves under the authority of their masters, but he also challenges their masters to treat their slaves as Christ has treated them. It's very interesting. And to see this play out in even more specific terms, and to really get how, in a sense, radical Paul's teaching is along those lines, check out the book of Philemon, which is all about this issue of this slave and his relationship to his master. It's a very interesting concept. So when we enter into modern discussions of what Paul is getting at here, it's very important to keep in mind that the context of what is being talked about as slavery here has moved a little bit since it was talked about in the first century world.